Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to have with us two experts in the energy field, Alex Trembath from the Breakthrough Institute, and Robert Bryce, film producer, journalist, and host of the Power Hungry podcast. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for having me. With you.
Today, we're going to be talking about the impact on the energy world of Russia's military moves in Ukraine. Joe, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, basically, what we're seeing now in the wake of the Russian invasion and all the issues around Russian oil and gas, and even some from the Ukraine, how has the debate changed? And is it just a temporary change, or are people thinking in very different ways than they were beforehand?
Go ahead, Alex.
Alex, particularly, let's say in the environmental world where you come from.
Sure. Thanks, Joel, and thanks, Robert, and thanks for having me. So I think it's a pretty tectonic shift in the way that we think about our energy supply and our sort of status as energy consumers. Post-Russian invasion, I think we're dealing with, for the first time in really decades, we're dealing with really sort of salient, sharp sense of energy insecurity and potential for sort of heightening energy shortages. This might just be the beginning. We can get into sort of what that means for energy prices, for energy supply, for sort of strategic decisions that countries, especially in Europe, are going to make, but also in North America and Asia are going to make regarding their energy supply. But I do think about this from a sort of environmental perspective, and I would just observe that the sort of conversation that we've been having about the global environment, about climate change over the last 10, 15 years, especially, since the release of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, and since the Obama administration, since we started paying a lot more attention to climate change in the last 10, 15 years, was really a period of certainly global energy abundance, really, relative to history, and especially American energy abundance. So this is the same period during which the U.S. fracking revolution occurred, which was initially sort of a wash of new natural gas resources in the United States and a little bit later oil resources, to the point where we have the most abundant and cheapest natural gas on the planet in the United States, and that has had all sorts of implications. And we actually produce more oil than we consume for the first time in almost a century in the United States. And so the way that we think about climate change occurred when fossil fuels and really all energy technologies across the portfolio were really abundant. And it was easy to talk about, oh, our energy is too cheap, or, oh, we have too much, or we need to be cutting back. Those frames were a little bit gentler, I think, a little bit more simpatico. But once you have energy shortages, once you have not just the threat of energy insecurity, but the reality of the tap being shut off, of real shortages of oil and natural gas, especially, but sort of price spikes and shortages across the energy supply chain, I think it gets a lot harder to talk about sort of cutting back. It gets harder to talk about punishing the fossil fuel industry. And I would make just one observation before I hand it over to Robert, which is that, for a long time, what we've heard is that fossil fuels are too expensive. We need to be regulating them tighter. We need to be putting a price on carbon. I'm generally in favor of a lot of those things. But you'll notice that since the Russian invasion, senators like Elizabeth Warren have been saying that fossil fuels are now price gouging their customers and making energy too expensive, making oil and gas too expensive for consumers. You see the Sunrise Movement, one of the biggest progressive environmental activist communities, making the same charge that fossil fuels are too expensive today and it's hurting consumers, which is the kind of whiplash that I think is indicative of this total tectonic shift that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, Robert, what's your take on it?
Sure. Well, I think Alex hits on some really key points there. And I think, and I say this as a nonpartisan, right? I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. But the Democrats are scared. I mean, they really, and they should be, because, consumers stand there for 2 or 3 minutes and they look at the price of gasoline and they sit there and they watch it and they know what that price is. They may not tell you what they know, what the price of the milk is that they bought at the store last week, but they can tell you to the penny how much they bought for how much they paid for their gasoline. So from a pure populist and, just retail politics standpoint, Democrats are scared, and well, they should be. And they're trying to shift this blame, and they had this show hearing, with the House, let's flagellate these oil executives for making these unconscionable profits. And it's silly when you compare their profit margins to Apple or Google. I mean, it's just not even comparable. But back to the energy realism, and I think that Alex hit it exactly right. I think this is an inflection point. And you see, after I'm just looking at a chart here, a price chart on Trading Economics on the price of coal, the Newcastle benchmark, on February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it went vertical. I mean, it went from about $160, and then it peaked at over $430. Now it's settled now to about $300. But remember, at the beginning of 2021, a ton of coal coming out of Newcastle was under $100. And then you have the price of natural gas in the U.S. at Henry Hub is under $6 today. In Europe at the TTF trading hub, it's $34. So almost 5 or 6 times what we're paying here in the U.S. So but remember, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that while we're talking a lot about the U.S. and Western Europe, what is happening in India? What's happening in Asia? China just announced in the last few weeks they're going to increase their coal production by 300 million tons a year. That increase is equal to half of all U.S. coal production. So I think that these shockwaves that are happening, not just in energy, but in food because of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they're going to last for a very long time.
Well, let's focus a little bit on that last point about food, because I think that you're right. People are very sensitive to the price of gas at the pump, and that's what they think of when they think of oil, right? And they think of the stopping of that. Most people, at least in the United States, don't think about the implications on natural gas and heating in Europe. And the last thing they think about is supply chain disruptions when it comes to the food supply. So do you think, we've gone on this huge movement toward organic foods, toward food production for using less petrochemicals. Given the state here of supply, is that going to shift back? How are we going to adapt to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of the conversation, as you gesture at, is focused on oil and gas for good reason. But there are a couple other sort of supply bottlenecks and insecurities to pay attention to here. One is to remember that Russia and Ukraine are major global exporters of wheat, which is essential to nutrition across the globe. And it's really important to remember the thing I think a lot of people forget is that the most important feedstock into synthetic fertilizer production is methane, is natural gas, where we're seeing price increases of 2, 3, 5x in certain markets around the world, and that makes food more expensive. Again, I think to your question, Marshall, about sort of organic versus sort of industrial agriculture and how the Russian invasion of Ukraine will affect how we shop at the grocery store and how we think about our consumer purchases of food. I think it's relatively easy to talk about the sort of benefits of high-priced organic agriculture, at the grocery store, or sort of niche production of organic agriculture, when it's a small chunk of the global agricultural system, which is overwhelmingly reliant on synthetic fertilizers, on hydrocarbons, on irrigation, on tractors, on pesticides, on these sort of massive industrial inputs into our food system. It's sort of easy to imagine that organic can replace all that when again in an era of relative nutritional abundance, like we have been living in mostly. The supply of food and the security of food supplies has been increasing for decades, and I don't know exactly what the sort of ripple effects of the situation in Ukraine are going to have on food supplies. But when food gets expensive, I think it starts to get harder to imagine that this whole other system of producing food, which is not reliant on synthetic fertilizers. It's reliant on cover crops and manure for fertilizers. It's not reliant on industrial pesticides. all of these things that make organic food more expensive, that kind of works when you have 80, 85, 90% of your food supply coming from cheap industrial food. Once food gets expensive at the same time as energy is getting expensive, I think it becomes a little bit harder to sort of make that fit.
I just want to ask, there seems to me that there would be political implications on two levels. One, domestically inside the United States, where energy producing areas and also middle and working class people are affected immediately. You know, they're not out there buying a Tesla, although right now, given the electricity prices, the Teslas might not even be cheaper than gasoline. But you have that domestically, but also on a global level. Are we also seeing if we have a class divide, both domestically, but also on a global level? I mean, issues that are going, like I have somebody working in South Africa right now on the issue of food scarcity throughout Africa. So is this going to have, this energy surge going to have implications for politics, both globally and nationally?
Well, I can just speak to, I'm just looking at some price tickers here. So wheat prices year on year up 63%, palm oil's up 57%, milk 36%, cheese 30%, orange juice 54%, coffee up 81%, cotton 61%, oats up 109%, canola 42%. My mom used to own some wheat land in Oklahoma. She would love this, right? With these prices, but this is social unrest, the Arab Spring. Some people point to food prices as one of the reasons of the catalysts for that. But I think that if we pull back, though, the thing that is obvious to me, and I've been making this point for a while, but what these fertilizer shortages and the soaring price of fertilizer show yet again, the all renewable lie was a lie. It's been a lie all along, and it's been promoted by some very powerful interests. And there are a lot of big businesses in America that are profiting from this because of this belief that we can run the world on renewables. We can't replace the Haber-Bosch process. We cannot replace the fertilizer that we get from natural gas. And the full stop, as Alex Epstein says, it's exactly right. Hydrocarbons are the food of food. And now we're seeing these knock-on effects. And what I fear is that this is going to take years to work out, because Europe is not going to be able to restart its drilling sector in anything like the short term. So there's going to be stress in natural gas markets. We already see it in Europe. LNG from the U.S. is going to be able to fill in some of the supply. But remember, that's high-priced hydrocarbons, which is one of the reasons why we see utilities in Europe rushing back to buy as much coal as they can. And there are limits on the availability of coal as well. But this is going to be a years long.
So the question that brings up is, it brings up a million realignment questions. The first one is Paris Climate Accords. Given the strategic imperative of feeding people and heating people's homes, do you think that we will be seeing a lightening up or a backing away from the implementation of Paris Accords over the next couple of years?
I think it's important to remember that the Paris Accords are a voluntary pact among nations. And a lot of people talk about the Paris Accords in relation to the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature target, which is a prospective sort of hopeful target that was mentioned in the context of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was really an agreement among nations to utilize their independently national determined contribution to global climate action, the INDCs as they were called, the NDCs, which was really just asking nations to do as much as they can to reduce their emissions. So it's a fundamentally voluntary and actually pretty flexible sort of superstructure for thinking about international climate negotiations and climate action. But it also doesn't have really any teeth whatsoever.
So the imperative is feed your people. People are going to say, of course, we're going to lighten up on compliance with those kinds of with those Paris Accords.
Well, look what India is doing. India is basically taking a neutral position on this, and that's the world's biggest democracy.
Yeah, and I think that I think that just structurally, barring some crazy inflection point in human population and technology, that we are in the midst of a long-term at least plateau, and most likely sort of a gradual, at least, decline of global carbon emissions, over the next 10, 20 years. I don't think that we'll have them within the next couple decades, or any of the really ambitious hopes of the climate community. But I think, with the sort of rise of the global middle class, the shift to sort of knowledges and services of the global economy, and the shift, increasing sort of industrial efficiency and end use efficiency, and the shift from coal to natural gas, not just in the United States, but around the world. And natural gas is about half the emissions intensity of coal. That emissions are in a sort of structural decline. Not a sort of dramatic one, but at least a gradual one, which has sort of buffeted I think the vision of climate action among the international climate negotiators, among the sort of environmental and climate community. But again, it's very easy to feel very optimistic about in an era of structural emissions decline, of energy abundance, where you can sort of subsidize renewables, maybe build some nuclear plants, depending on the sort of disposition of your national leadership. You can deploy electric vehicles. I think we'll start doing a lot more of that. But we're also going to see coal come back in Europe as these natural gas prices rise. I think we're going to see oil and gas production in places like North America tick back up, and I think there's going to be broad support for that. Obviously not from the climate community, but from Republicans and Democrats. So I think that moments like these, rare as they are, really throw into sharp relief what people care about, and it's easy to care about climate action, and it's easy to care about cutting back on fossil fuel production. It's easy to care about things like, quote unquote, punishing the fossil fuel industry when fossil fuels are highly abundant. And when the taps turn off, and when Europe is threatened with blackouts this winter, depending on the status of imports of Russian oil and gas, and when prices at the pump in North America are what they are, they're like $6 a gallon where I live in Northern California, then I think that starts to reorganize people's priorities.
Yeah, Robert, you're a market guy. You follow markets all the time. You view the world in terms of kind of the market alternatives that ebb and flow as supply and demand change. What are there fundamental shifts in the market that you think will be long-term for these kinds of different alternative fuels that you think will be with us for a while?
Well, sure. And I think one of the key things here, Joel mentioned India, but I think that we already saw this before February 24th, before the invasion of Ukraine. It was the China and Russia tying more closely together, right? So you had, I think now roughly 2 years ago, the beginning of gas shipments from Russia to China through the Power of Siberia pipeline. This is a massive project, 5,000-mile long natural gas pipeline, $400 billion in contracted delivery over 30 years. And then they just in the last few months announced the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. So there's no doubt that this pushes, and you had the recent vote, I think it was just yesterday at the UN, to throw Russia out of the Human Rights Commission. Who voted against it? China. So the closer ties between China and Russia were already begun. I think that's going to be clearly they're going to become even more closely aligned.
Yeah. So what that really means, right? What that really means is that if Russia loses Europe as a customer for its natural gas, they'll just pipe the stuff south. And that, in fact, if you look at the aggregate demand, which is kind of where you were going with all of this,
yeah,
the Chinese can more than absorb the supply that's coming out of those two pipelines, or the two production sources, right?
Yeah. And I'll just add one other quick thing, which is that I think that the other effect here, and we see it already here in the U.S., and I've been writing about this for a long time, and I'm a longtime critic of the renewables business because of their land use issues. Last Saturday in Lovell, Maine, a small town in Maine, they voted 80% to 20% against a large new solar project that was proposed in the town. This is just the latest example of these land use conflicts that are limiting the growth of renewables. and therefore I think forcing more energy realism. It's slow, but it's real, and these land use conflicts are at play in Europe as well. So the energy realism is going to be on price, it's going to be on land use, and it's going to be on, as you said, Marshall, the feeding your people and keeping the lights on.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, Joel.
Well, and I'd like to focus a little bit on China, because China, as you mentioned, is the big beneficiary of, in many ways, in terms of they're probably getting better deals on natural gas from Russia now than they might have before. But do you think, in a sense, we're playing a game of rope-a-dope? If you go back to the Muhammad Ali, where China says, "Oh yeah, we're going to reduce our emissions in 2060," or meanwhile, we're going to use coal, natural gas, while you're, having, unreliable, super expensive energy. And we're just going to end up deindustrializing you. And then, oh yeah. And then when China finally does its nukes, and, China will do what it needs to do on climate eventually. But by then, the Western world will be a vacation spot for rich Chinese.
I think the danger is partly what you get at, Joel, and partly that China is actually very serious about both its short-term and its long-term commitments. So you can absolutely think of the sort of China net zero by 2060 as a sort of really exciting on paper, but not much else. I think that.
What do you mean by that, Alex? Could you explain that?
I mean that we should take all of these long-term decarbonization net zero commitments with a grain or two of salt. Whether it's Gavin Newsom saying that we're going to have no internal combustion engines on the road in California by 2035, or whether it's Xi Jinping saying that China is going to be net zero by 2060. I think that there is some genuine ambition and some genuine sort of thinking in there. I think that I tend to be degrees more optimistic about sort of long-term decarbonization than Robert is. I think, for instance, that hydrogen-produced fertilizers or some of these microbial coatings on seeds to capture nitrogen could be very, very effective and promising in the long term. But I do think, to take one example, but I do think that Robert is exactly right, that it is moments like the post-invasion of Ukraine that throw into sharp relief the sort of nature of our energy production realities today and the nature of our energy supplies today. It's one thing to say we're going to decarbonize by 2050, 2070. It's one thing to say we can get off the Haber-Bosch process in the long term. It's one thing to say that we're going to have grid scale energy storage supporting wind and solar later this century. Those are sort of helpful visions for, I think, sort of climate messaging and climate activism that become a lot less helpful in a crisis and a lot less useful again when crisis spike and supplies are disrupted.
But there's another game that I think is going on that I would love to get your opinion on. So imagine this for a moment. If you're Xi Jinping and you're Putin, and you're sitting and you're talking together and you're saying, hey, how do we beat these guys? How do we, Xi Jinping, and I believe this is the ultimate strategic objective of China, is to be the place in the world that makes everything. And therefore, the world will become dependent upon China, whether that is physical things or whether it's digital things. China is seeking to be the leader in all of that. And so, of course, if you're going to be the leader in all of that, you're going to need to have guaranteed supply of the energy that's required to make the physical things. And by the way, required to make the digital thing, because you need electricity also. So it's very clear that Putin would be an ally of China to be able to make that happen as a bloc. But the question that I have is, does that result in basically a free-for-all for everybody else to become as self-sufficient as possible and not get sucked into that game? So does that bring on a new era of national self-interest in every country? And maybe arguably the EU can stick together as a bloc, and because the countries themselves don't have the scale to be able to compete do you think we're going to see kind of a reversion back to kind of overall nationalist self-interest and especially in the U.S. Self-sufficiency kinds of strategies?
I'll jump in there, Marshall. I think that there is, we already saw even during the COVID era push for more reshoring, particularly on pharmaceuticals. But I think that, you know, what if there, I know Joel has somewhat more of a bleak outlook than I do, but there could be a scenario where we see this reshoring accruing to the benefit of the U.S. because you have industrial companies leaving Europe and coming to the U.S. because we have the rule of law and we have low cost energy, particularly compared to Europe. So we saw some of this during the shale revolution, fertilizer makers, other big industrial outfits, petrochemical companies coming to the U.S. to the Gulf Coast, to Louisiana. That may well accelerate. But I think the other point there that, and I'll just bring up the issue of supply chains here, which is that, you know, when you look at these alternative technologies, I don't call them green technologies, they're alternative energy technologies. Those prices and those commodities are controlled by China. I'm looking at the lithium price; it's up 450% over the last year. So this idea, we're going to have large scale grid storage. Yeah, right. Yeah. This is Elon Musk's long bet, but it's not, of course, just lithium. It's cobalt. It's neodymium, which is a key issue or key component of magnets, up 60%. China and nickel, up 100%. These are commodities that China and or Russia control the dominant share, if not a monopoly share, in these critical commodities. So the reshoring,
and by the way, and require a tremendous amount of energy to extract.
Oh yeah, of course.
So you have to have an energy supply even to be able to get the stuff out of the ground and refined to some degree.
Absolutely.
I don't think that anyone really knows how the sort of production side is going to shake out in the long term. I do think that, I think my guess would be is we have a significant reshuffling of industrial production, and I say this hopefully away from China and Russia, not to a future status where every nation on earth is mostly self-sufficient. I think we'll continue to be a global, specialized industrial economy with sort of significant global trade. But I think if we're lucky, then we actually diversify global supply chains away from places like Russia and China, but not just Russia and China. And what worries me is the sort of pass blocking that the environmental community in the rich world is doing for regimes like Xi Jinping on the sort of renewable energy and minerals and materials production side. And we've seen this for years, and it gets sort of, I think, less and less excusable every year that goes by, and especially less and less excusable after the invasion of Ukraine. You see climate hawks in places like Europe and the United States inveighing against the rest of us to not piss China off too much, and to not pursue sort of hawkish posture towards China on things like little things like human rights violations, and throwing Uyghur Muslims into concentration camps and cracking down on protests in Hong Kong. That those are all terrible things, but China is producing almost all the world's solar panels, lithium, rare earth metals, the things that we need to address the real emergency, which is climate change. And I think that has long been untenable and really appalling, sort of morally and actually geopolitically. And I think we're still seeing it, and I think it'll lose purchase much more quickly in this sort of new geopolitical reality that we're in today.
I sure hope so. Contemptible, disgusting. I can think of a whole lot of adjectives, Alex, that go along with what you just said. Yeah. Oh, well, let's not irritate the Chinese because they make our solar panels in polysilicon. And, oh, well, just a few Uyghur Muslims. Well, the State Department last year instituted bans on the importation of polysilicon from the major polysilicon producers in Xinjiang province. So, yeah, there are a lot of issues that are coming together here, but yeah, I agree with you, Alex. I think the actions of the Natural Resources Defense Council in particular have just been contemptible in this way.
And it's funny because it's ironic because this is the theme of this podcast is Joel's book about the reemergence of feudalism and the idea that we would have the economic choke points for the world economy not just the growth economy, but the actual sustaining economy of the world with food production and energy production be beholden to the new feudal overlords of the Chinese and the Russians. It's just kind of crazy to me. I just wonder. Obviously, everybody. I think most people see the absurdity of having the tremendous concentration of mineral extraction and manufacturing be centered in one place. I just wonder how quickly our own policymakers are going to be able to actually jump on that. Because I think they're actually, because of the fact that we do have the energy sources in the United States that are available to us, we are at a strategic advantage here in the US for things like reshoring and being a viable competitor to the Eurasian bloc, right? To the Russian Chinese bloc. Joel, what are your history, as you kind of look at history on this, any thoughts about from history of things that might indicate what might happen in the future?
Well, I think there's going to be, I think, a great game that will now open, which is that there will be this hunt for energy, and you're going to have this diversion between those people who want to deal with the real situation, food and stuff like that, and those who still live in this sort of ideological, theological universe. And what we know is that when people act based on some sort of faith, they often make mistakes, and they often are convinced that they're the master race or the uprising class, whatever it is. And I think that the environmental movement has sort of taken that on. Now, what I'd love to do in terms of in wrapping this up is saying, look, what do you see for the next year in the energy world, and what do you see politically? How is this going to affect 2022? And sort of like if you were going to say, okay, it's January 2023, what do you think the world is going to look like from an energy and political perspective? So I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, my guess is that, and I wouldn't want to make any hard predictions, but my guess is that this is the beginning, not the end or even the middle of our energy security woes, both in North America, especially in Europe and around the world, that food and energy prices will remain elevated through the end of 2022. In terms of American politics, I think that will make what was already a foregone conclusion look like a wave for Republicans during the midterm elections in November. And I suppose the one thing that I would say about that, I think that Marshall's right, that the United States especially is blessed both geographically and economically and technically with energy abundance still. It's a global oil market, prices are expensive, but we produce more energy than really any other country on the planet, from hydrocarbons to deploying advanced technologies like solar panels and hopefully some advanced geothermal and carbon capture and nuclear plants. I think when Republicans take office, and I don't really think it's an if anymore, they will be presented with an opportunity to capitalize on accelerating energy abundance in the United States through investments in energy production, whether it's minerals or fuels or low carbon technologies. And I think if they do it right, they have a big opportunity to reform the things that put a damper on energy abundance in the United States, and that's a lot of things, but it's overwhelmingly sort of environmental regulations, things like the National Environmental Protection Act, the Wilderness Act, the Jones Act. These regulations that make it really hard to build things in this country. They are not the only obstacles to building things. We don't have an experienced workforce. We have other regulations outside of environmental law. There are a whole bunch of things in our decadent society that make it difficult to build. But I think that this moment in North American politics, probably European politics, should should redound to some serious consideration of our sort of regulatory regime that makes it difficult or impossible to produce commodities, to build infrastructure projects, to build power plants, to build pipelines and things like that.
Gotta interrupt you. I've got to interrupt you to ask you this question, because I hear you going through the litany of regulation. Do you think this will trickle down to California?
Yeah, I would hope so. California is probably, it's the vanguard of the sort of environmental movement, which would probably mean it's sort of last in line to change its thinking on things like environmental regulation and things like things that policies that make energy more expensive for low
or building things, regulation that make it impossible to build here.
Right. I mean, I think Marshall's getting at the California Environmental Quality Act, which is like the National Environmental Policy Act on steroids. I would say it's one thing to reform CEQA, reform the Environmental Quality Act, to ensure that there are more undergraduates at UC Berkeley, which was the result of the latest legislation in Congress. And I fully supported that exemption to CEQA. So that more students could be admitted to UC Berkeley. It's a weaponization of environmental law, but I think it'll be a lot harder to reform CEQA when it comes to building transmission lines and solar farms and high-speed rail and all the things that climate hawks say that we really need, but oppose every time they're actually being deployed.
Or housing.
I'll just add a couple of quick things. One is that I too see the advantage, at least, we're here in April, so, a lot happens between now and November, but given Biden's relative weakness, given a 50-50 Senate, it sure appears the moment that Republicans are going to, control both houses beginning in January of 2023. What I would hope to see is that there's more energy realism in terms of the nuclear sector in the United States, that this is, I've said it over and over, and I'll keep saying it. There's no way to achieve any scale in decarbonization without widespread adoption of nuclear. But right now, the nuclear sector in the United States is all but dead. And I say all but dead. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is just a big obstacle to the deployment of any new nuclear in this country. And in fact,
and there's new technology there, right?
There's plenty of promising new technology, but we're still a decade away from the deployment of even one new reactor. I mean, this is a pitiful situation. China is building 46 reactors. We're building 2. What we've seen in Europe, I think, is interesting as well, is that you see the Belgians saying they're going to extend the life of their nuclear plants. Macron in France has said, we're going to double down. We're going to work on SMRs. Meanwhile, Germany, there's no explaining Germany. They're going to go ahead and close their nuclear reactors. But I think in January, we're going to have passed through a summer. This summer, I think we're going to see significantly higher prices in oil because the demand we haven't seen any destruction in demand so far, and supply has been constrained. So I think consumers by November are going to be tired of this, and they're going to be wanting more realism, and I hope we get it.
So the question becomes how we've dealt with the long term. We've dealt with the strategic issues of the realignment of nations and of blocks of nations. And we've looked at kind of the short-term implications, both politically and of the impact of shortages on food prices and on the rest of the economy. I guess the last question for the two of you is this. Looking past, say, the next year or two, are you optimistic or pessimistic when it comes to where things are going to turn out? You think there'll be some kind of positive synthesis that comes out of all of this?
I'm, as ever, optimistic in the long term. I'm concerned about the medium term, as you sort of describe it, Marshall. Not just the next sort of 6 weeks, but the next several years. I think we are in for potentially a years-long, if not crisis, then significant discomfort in global supply of energy and food. I think that can be an impetus towards really sort of an energy abundance agenda, sort of doubling down on innovation, sort of building more infrastructure, diversifying global supply chains for fuel and for technologies But you actually have to go do those things. And I think the sort of track record of the rich countries, especially the United States and the EU bloc, is lacking when it comes to sort of impressive industrial production over the last 20, 30 years. So I think this is exactly the kind of thing that should create enough sort of momentum for reforms, for reshoring of sort of things that it makes sense to reshore, for sort of reforming our regulatory regime to make building infrastructure and building sort of industrial production capacity. But I want to believe it. I will continue in my capacity to push for it, but there are headwinds, I guess, is how I think about it.
Robert, last word to you.
Oh, well, I wanted to hear what Joel had to say. I don't know. It's not my podcast, but I think I always like to hear what Joel has to say, but I think he would give a somewhat pessimistic. Is that, am I allowed to make that request?
No, I mean, I think historically systems do rebalance. I mean, we were total isolationists in the 1930s, and when given the proper stimulus, now hopefully there won't be a Pearl Harbor, America has a history of reacting and reforming itself, usually later than it would have been advised, usually 5-10 years too late. But we're not a completely stupid country, and the reality is that, thank God, AOC and Nancy Pelosi are not permanent dictators. So that I think there can be some positive change. The big question is, will enough of the Democratic Party break the party line and start thinking the way like Alex is talking about? That's my biggest question. So it's still the last word to you, Robert.
Well, fair enough. So I'm to quote the late Molly Ivins, I'm optimistic to the point of idiocy. I'm long the U.S. The U.S. has a lot of structural advantages relative to the rest of the world, including our belief in the Constitution, the rule of law, and it doesn't always work perfectly, but it is still a remarkably durable system, and so. But I also think there's going to be a lot of pain in the near term. These inflationary pressures are not going away. I see it here in Austin in rents. You see it in California in rents. I think there's going to be a lot more of this internal migration, and I see that as well here in Austin. I mean, people from California moving here. I mean, I don't. In some ways, I don't even recognize this town from what it was even a few years ago. I mean, I was out driving or riding my bike last night. I mean, just the flood of new people coming into town. So I think there are going to be states that this recovery, and I think I'm not optimistic for California, to be honest with you, because of all the structural problems in your state that all three of you know very well, know better than I do. But so I think that we're going to see the high grading of different states, benefiting from a lot of this turmoil. So, Colorado, Utah, Texas, succeeding at the expense, I think, of some other states. But I'm long-term optimistic. But I think there are going to be some, as Alex put it, headwinds that are going to be significant, and it's going to be very hard for the poor and the working class. I mean, just much more friction for them because of the price of energy, housing, and mobility, which we talked about last week in Houston. And I want to be more optimistic on those issues, but I see a lot of friction there.
Yeah, well, and you're right. I think it's going to take what is already a tough situation in many places, California being kind of the exemplar, and making it even tougher. So I think we got to buckle up for a rough ride ahead. But hopefully, you're right. I think the long-term ability of Americans to innovate their way out of a problem and come up with ways of moving things ahead is very, very strong. So we're with you on that. Gentlemen, thank you for being part of the
Feudal Future
podcast. This has just been great, and we wish you the best.
Well, that's very kind. Thanks. Flattered to be invited.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.